But I was especially pleased to see mention of the Middle East and the two-state solutions, and for reasons that I am sure are obvious, that is what I will be focusing my remarks on today. It's now been nearly 300 days since the horrific Hamas attack on October the 7th. And since then, hostages have still not returned home. The death toll in Gaza has reached 38,000, the vast majority being women and children, and there are, of course, thousands more under the rubble left out of the statistics. Scientists fear the death toll is going to soar, and if you take into account indirect casualties of war, people who die of malnutrition, a lack of medication, or unsanitary living conditions, a letter in the medical journal The Lancet predicted the total number of deaths could climb as high as 186,000. The children of Gaza have suffered the unimaginable. Alexandra Sai, the head of humanitarian policy and advocacy at Save the Children International, said, "They are being dismembered. They have been burned alive in tents. They have been killed due to collapsing apartment building blocks. They have also been killed by preventable diseases and illnesses and denied medical assistance. Children in Gaza are suffering horrifically. In the first 3 months of this conflict alone, 1,000 children had one or both legs amputated. That meant more than 10 children losing one or both legs every single day. So we need that immediate ceasefire, and we needed it 6 months ago. Madam Deputy Speaker, there is only one way to end the killing, to get those hostages safely home, and to get that humanitarian aid in. Nothing can happen after that point until the ceasefire is achieved. But we must also understand that that ceasefire is not enough for peace. Peace is not just the absence of war. It is hope that is shared, a future where Palestinians and Israelis will live in security and dignity. That is what we mean by a two-state solution. That is the real prize. Now, I must say to the House, I have been relieved to be a Liberal Democrat during the last few months. In all seriousness, when my family were under siege in that church in Gaza, and the professional and the personal collided completely, and I got that devastating news in November that I had lost a family member, my cousins texted me to tell me, and all they asked for was that ceasefire. And it's what the Liberal Democrats have consistently argued for. Because when it comes to matters of foreign policy, we ground our approach in liberal principles of human rights and the international rules-based order.
Give way on this point.
I will.
I thank the member for giving way and congratulate her on a very powerful speech that she's making. And I agree with her call for an immediate ceasefire. Does she also believe that we should halt arms supplies to Israel, which are being used to bomb Gaza at the present time, and makes us and the United States complicit in the killing of so many people in Gaza?
I thank the right honourable member for his intervention. I'll be coming to exactly those points and expanding on them in my remarks. Thank you. It was that approach that we took of international rules-based order and humanitarian law that led us to being on the right side of the argument when it came to apartheid in South Africa and to Hong Kong, and indeed the war in Iraq, and it so guides our approach now. So I am pleased, delighted even, that the government has included reference to the all-important two-state solution in the King's speech. And I am heartened very much by the change in tone by the government. But words are meaningless without concrete action. And it is vital that we start from now thinking about what we need to do the day after that ceasefire is secured. Because at some point it will be. We all know that. Now, Hamas are extremes in this debate, but so is Netanyahu. Neither want peace, It is in neither of their interests. And it is the framing of one versus the other that has proved to be so insidious in this debate. There are plenty of voices in Israel and Palestine and beyond who are partners in peace and are actively calling for it. Protest in Israel is growing, with demonstrations being held in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, clamouring for a deal to be done to bring those hostages home. And they often link that to a ceasefire, and indeed the release of Palestinian political prisoners like Marwan Barghouti. That wider movement for peace is growing. And so I want to tell the House about two friends of mine, Maoz and Magen Inon. They lost their parents on October the 7th when Hamas targeted their house with a close-range missile. In fact, I went to Nativ Hazara. I've been twice, once before and once since, and I saw their house and their burnt-out car. And it was heartbreaking. But rather than turn to hatred, they chose instead to now spend their whole lives talking about peace, because they realize that they don't want this to happen to anyone else's family. And there is only one way to guarantee that, and that is peace and a shared future. And so in them, and in all those Israeli peace activists, a movement that is growing, I see that shared future. But this chamber needs to understand, and this government needs to understand, people like Maoz and Magen are embers in a nascent fire, and they need the oxygen of political support so that they can survive and grow. And the same is true for Palestinian peace activists, Hamza and Ahmed, who I recently shared a panel with. All of us, children of the Nakba, but all of us willing to devote our futures to stop the endless taking of lives, to avenge a past we no longer want to keep resurrecting over and over and over again. These are the voices that deserve to be amplified. And this is the kind of rhetoric I hope that we can all take, bringing people together, not seeking to divide. Now, I say this with some disappointment, because in the remarks of the leader of the opposition in response to the King's speech yesterday, I note he didn't mention Palestine at all. He only mentioned Israel. We cannot do that. We have to understand that if we want the security and freedom for Israel, then you cannot do that without security and freedom for Palestine too. And that is why the mention of the two-state solution is so vital. So, a two-state solution, let's start with the basics. It needs two states, which is why we must recognize the state of Palestine along 1967 borders immediately without preconditions. I have laid a bill in every parliamentary session since I was elected, and I will do so again. 140 countries have already taken this step, including Ireland, Spain and Norway just this May, and if the UK were to join them, it would send a powerful message to the Israeli government that we are serious about two states, something, by the way, that Netanyahu has rejected. But it would also send a message to the Palestinian people, desperate for hope that the international community, and in particular the UK, with our long-standing historic obligations to the region, are going to help them achieve that future. Now, many will also say, and they're right, that recognition is not enough. One of the biggest barriers to peace are the illegal Israeli settlements in the West Bank. In 2024, Israel illegally seized 23.7 square kilometres of Palestinian land in the occupied West Bank. That's more than all the land it's taken over the last 20 years combined. These settlements are illegal under international law. They exacerbate tension and they undermine the viability of that precious two-state solution. We have called for individual violent settlers who breach international law to be sanctioned, and I was pleased to see the then Conservative government taking some small steps sanctioning individual settlers. But we need to go further, and I would urge the government to do so. Liberal Democrats have called for sanctions to include the ministers Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, and also the connected entities who provide support or enable these extremist individuals. Since 2021, we have also called for the UK to ban trade with illegal settlements. And the reason for that is because if they are illegal under international law, then we should be putting a firm marker in the sand. British weapons, to come to the honourable gentleman's point, is another form of trade that we think needs to be handled with great care. Now, our policy is not to single out Israel. That is important. It is a policy that is built on ensuring that no British-made arms are sold to any countries who are in potential breach of human rights violations. And that is why we, at the current time, believe that we should be looking at our arms export trade with Israel. I do note that despite repeated calls, the government never released its own legal advice on potential breaches on international law in this conflict. But given that there is a case to answer at the ICJ and the ICC, the British public deserve to know whether the government is breaching its own arms export regime. I note that the Foreign Secretary, when he was Shadow Foreign Secretary, had asked for that legal advice to be released. I'm curious to see whether he will make good on that promise. And while we're on the subject of courts, it is vital that the UK government full-throatedly supports the ICC and the ICJ in their investigations and judgments. The UK government must support them and their processes and outcome without fear or favour. This goes beyond this conflict. This has international ramifications if we undermine these courts that are very much the bedrock of our international rules-based order. So while, when they were in government, the Conservatives did undermine these processes, I had hoped for better from Labour, and I still hope for better. In January this year, the now Foreign Secretary said his party believed that if there was an arrest warrant issued for Netanyahu, then they would honour it. Since then, Karim Khan at the ICC has issued one for Hamas leaders and Netanyahu, but the block to the issuing by the UK, something that should be removed, we understand from media, may have remained in place. And it would be very helpful for the Foreign Secretary to come to the House and explain the position. And I will, of course.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady, and as ever, she is a powerful advocate on injustices all over the world. But the point in particular she raises with regards to the international rules-based order is one that is very powerful, because the international rules-based order and the international legal system must provide equal protection to all people and must be free from double standards. The minute those two things do not apply, then the very nature of the rules-based order we are talking is at threat itself.
May I thank the honourable member for his intervention. I couldn't agree with him more, and it has really concerned me how people are now perceiving a double standard between what is happening in this conflict and what is happening, say, between Ukraine and Russia. Very different conflicts. But what we have to do as politicians is bolster that international rules-based order so that people have faith that where there are injustices anywhere in the world, they will be put through a proper process and then determined after that. I'm afraid to say we are at risk, not just this country but the US as well, of undermining that system, and I would urge the government to take a different approach to how it had previously. So I'll simply end by saying I would urge the government to go further and faster when it comes to a two-state solution. I'd love to see a plan for what they mean by leading. I would offer my services with pleasure, because we need that two-state solution with Israelis and Palestinians living side by side in dignity and security. It's going to take much more than a change in tone to get there. And it's vitally what we need to achieve not just in Israel-Palestine, but in the Middle East and the region as a whole.